All right, welcome to Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg, and I really wanted to do a live stream today. We had some tech issues. I'm certainly not going to belabor them. Looks like we got those resolved, but that's always a struggle. So I really wanted to talk about Krugman's column today. I used to really admire Professor Paul Krugman. Of course, he is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and although he's not as far to the left as I am, I always kind of thought he was a real progressive. He believed in some kind of economic justice, and maybe he does. But his column today, Dateline yesterday, belies any claim by him or his supporters that he has some real compassion, empathy, or even a real, I think, understanding of global politics. This was just an absolute embarrassment for the newspaper to publish it. And I'm not, unlike Krugman, going to get into the motives. He is very, very eager to cast aspersions on everyone who disagrees with his very, very misguided, at best, inhumane, at worst, take about the Ukraine war. He's just wrong. Why MAGA wants to betray Ukraine? So if there's a betrayal, that would suggest that we have some kind of obligation, that the United States has some kind of treaty ironclad with Ukraine. We don't. They're not part of NATO. We don't owe them defense. We don't owe them a constant supply of weapons of mass destruction. Now, there's a certain moral obligation, I'll grant you, based on the fact that our actions, along with NATO's, are a significant factor in the Russian invasion. I don't think Russia would have invaded Ukraine if they hadn't been provoked by the West, if we hadn't been expanding NATO to their borders, putting weapons already in Ukraine, supplying them with weapons, if there wasn't a Western-backed coup in 2014 that overthrew the at least the somewhat less bellicosely anti-Russian president at that point. And we ultimately installed this Western Zelensky, and acknowledge he got the votes, but he wasn't president until the Maidan coup, which did remove the former Russia, at least less unfriendly president. So there's a lot of blame to go around. It isn't just all on Putin. That said, I don't endorse what Putin did. I do understand it when you look at what the United States has been doing for centuries, when we've perceived our military and economic interests at risk in this hemisphere, in the Western hemisphere. You've just seen it over and over and over. I mean, I said in centuries, it's been 3 centuries. I mean, you can go back to the 1890s and the the Spanish-American War, the Cuban, Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders in Cuba. Obviously, throughout the 20th century, we have been interfering with our neighbors and those who are far away from us, including on the other side of the world, at least in terms of the northern versus southern hemisphere. When you look at what happened in Chile, many certainly on the right defend our overthrowing a democratically elected socialist based on the fear that he might be not as aggressively, quote, anti-communist, anti-Russia, unquote, as the dictator, the tyrant that we installed, Pinochet. So to claim somehow that Russia is acting in some unique or ugly way that hasn't been, that we haven't led the way, we haven't demonstrated equally bad or worse behaviors for, well over 100 years is absurd. You could even just look at Grenada. We invaded a tiny little country, Grenada. So I don't, look at any decision about whether we should or shouldn't fund a war, a proxy war, as a betrayal. Although I do think, obviously, we have an obligation to try to protect the people who live in Ukraine and try to maintain some kind of democratic government there. But we should do it in a way that isn't likely to lead to World War III, that isn't going to result in hundreds of thousands, over 500,000 casualties to date. If anyone's betraying Ukraine, it's those who insist that we should just keep on providing a bottomless supply of weaponry that is killing Ukrainians and killing Russians as well. I think this picture, this image, the lone soldier from behind, the lone hero, perhaps looking off into the distance at the Russian hordes that are coming to control, to take over Ukraine, to take away his freedoms, is very instructive of the kind of propaganda that you get in this piece by Krugman. I mean, just that selection of that image, I think a far more resonant image, a far more accurate image, maybe an image that would have really, that reflects more fully the experience of Ukraine in this war, is this woman in just absolute agony, as you can tell from her face, looking at the complete destruction of her home, of her homeland, maybe loved ones killed, as you can see in that bombed out building. That's what our promotion of this war is doing. And for Krugman to allude, to call it a betrayal, to say, hey, we want to stop the killing, is just absolutely a perversion of language. He's perverting language to say, hey, if I don't want to keep funding that war to the tune of billions and billions of dollars, if I don't want to keep this proxy killing going, somehow I'm betraying I'm betraying this woman here, is just, as I said, it's a perversion of language. Words mean what I say they mean, not anything else, as Humpty Dumpty said. All right, let's get to the specific arguments that Krugman provides in support of the endless war. He, first of all, extols this as a reducing as helping stop China from invading Taiwan. Now, I thought this was somewhat plausible. I really wanted to look into this. Is this true? And frankly, there's quite a bit of dispute on the internet. The sources do not agree. There's no consensus that yes, by providing all this weaponry, by adding significantly to the national debt, we are somehow preventing Beijing from invading Taiwan. And maybe it's true. Some are arguing it. Those who backed the war in the first place, like Krugman, seem to think this is the case. And I mean, it's not totally implausible, perhaps. But I will play a clip for you in a moment from another Western leader than ours, who also supports the war, Emmanuel Macron. He seems to have a different take. By the way, you're watching Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg, 240-363-7190 if you want to join me at any point. And we do ask you, I always ask you, please click subscribe. I got to get my subscription numbers up. I want to get to 1,000 by the end of the year. It's looking like a pretty ambitious goal, but I hope we can get there. I think this program, honestly, and obviously I'm being a little bit, self-glorifying, whatever, I think it's worth it. I think having a different kind of voice, I was thinking about this because it's so hard to get what I would consider to be somewhat unbiased, objective information anywhere. Just looking to try to get some sense out of what's going on with the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden saga. It's virtually impossible. Either the New York Times and the Washington Post are all they're going to do is demonize the Republicans and say everything they're doing and saying is a complete lie, or Joe Biden's as corrupt as Trump, or I mean, if you believe Fox and OAN, he's 10 times Trump is as honest as the day is long, and Biden's a complete crook. Now, I don't think Biden is nearly as corrupt as Trump. I haven't seen the evidence, but it's awfully hard to find any source that you can really trust in these times. And those who say, well, yeah, you can trust the Washington Post, you can trust the New York Times. No, they told you the lab leak was a hoax. They told you that the Russians are responsible for Trump. They are not trustworthy sources either. It is very, very difficult. You know what? One reason that I am skeptical of the Joe Biden is, Joe Biden was taking bribes, right? Because that's what this investigation is about. The Joe Biden is taking bribes argument, or the Joe Biden was using influence for personal gain in Ukraine, is because I'll give you two sources I trust, Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal. And I don't totally trust Max either. He's been saying the Uyghur persecution by China is vastly overstated, is exaggerated. I'm skeptical of that. I don't know that he's convinced me that that's true. But I generally trust them. And neither one has weighed in at any point on the story that Joe Biden was pressure, all this pressure, this undue pressure was brought to bear on the prosecutor, or, to fire a prosecutor. I understand that did happen. It doesn't look great, but I haven't heard Mate or Blumenthal go into that, and certainly not provide evidence that Joe Biden was taking bribes to help, in return for, or was extorting money in return for benefits to his son, or he was benefiting from Hunter Biden's clearly undeserved promotions to various boards of directors. That was clearly done because of influence peddling by Biden, Hunter Biden. But whether Joe Biden personally profited from it, that's far, far, far murkier. And I just am not accepting, even like what Pasta said, who's been filling in for Jimmy Dore, where he said, oh, we know this. Well, I don't know it. I can't find the evidence of it. So I'm skeptical of everyone on both sides. All right. So let's get into now the New York Times. Why am I so skeptical of Krugman and his claims about why we need to support Ukraine, and how evil the right wing is, the MAGA people, how they hate our freedoms, as we'll see, is one of Krugman's slurs and slanders against conservatives. But he says, Russia's failures in Ukraine have surely, he states with absolute certainty, with absolute confidence, they've surely reduced the chances that China will invade Taiwan. I guess because we're all united, we have struck fear in the heart of Beijing that any chance that they might have to overcome the rightful successor to the Sun Yat-sen democratic regime is completely, is completely kiboshed by how the West has stood firm against Russian aggression, just like they will against Chinese. That's the theory. And I personally want us to keep China out of Taiwan. I don't want a nuclear war, but I want it very, very clear to China that you can't go into Taiwan. I think the way to do that is, again, through the United Nations, through united international pressure, which is what we should be bringing to bear to end the hostilities in Ukraine at this point and to come up with some workable peace. But is it in fact accurate what Krugman says, that somehow the West has scared China into staying out of Taiwan? Here's what Emmanuel Macron has to say, and this was back very recently. I shouldn't say back on August 28th, and he puts the lie to the new, more muscular, more powerful, more influential West, NATO. So let's play some of this.
was a wide-ranging speech by President Macron. He also spoke of what he called a weakening Europe on the world stage. Have a listen.
All right. So what she's saying is that Macron is decrying, expressed on the 28th his fear that his concern that the West just doesn't have the influence it once did, that it's losing, a say, that the kind of, I don't know, hegemony that it might have had. And if it's indeed losing that hegemony, then why would China suddenly put a lot of stock in what we're doing and suddenly say, oh, no, we're never going to go into Taiwan? Let's hear some more specifics from Macron.
Is the Russia's war against Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine and the waging of the war against Ukraine, which has really forced a lot of the world, especially a lot of the developing and poorer countries in the world that are more dependent on Russia, into a more subservient position with respect to Russia.
So what he's saying is that because these smaller countries in the global south, developing world, they don't have the luxury of just standing up to Putin. So instead, they're kind of moving over to Putin. That suggests our authority, our influence is truly diminished. Now, I don't think that's why some of these countries are moving into a more neutral or perhaps even pro-Russia status. I think they're scared of the big bad West. I think they look at what the United States and Western countries have been doing to Africa and to Asia with colonialism for 500 years or more. And they're like, we got to get away from these people. They kill our leaders. They turn our countries into terrorist training zones and kill hundreds and hundreds, if not millions of our people, which is exactly what happened in Iraq, which is what happened in Libya. They're thinking we need a better ally. If this is our ally, we go for our enemy. So Macron is saying it's just the opposite of what Krugman argues. The West's influence is diminished. It's not going to be able. We're not going to be able to prevent China from invading Taiwan if that's what they want to do. All right, let's get to some more. That clearly what Western leader neo-con, right? Macron is a backer of this war. He's not somebody who's like, oh, I'm a peacenik, I don't want more killing. He's fine with the killing. He's just saying this war ain't helping us. He's just being honest about it in that moment. Although I think his honesty is a little bit, it's disingenuous. Because he's claiming, well, we have reduced influence around the world because these smaller countries don't have the luxury, perhaps, of bucking Moscow, of saying no to Moscow. I don't think that's it at all. I think it's that they are scared of us. They're more scared of us. They're more scared that we're going to tell them what they can and cannot do than they're scared of Russia. That's really what it boils down to. So here's some more argument from Krugman. Let's see if we think this is a little more plausible or perhaps more plausible. Because I don't think it's completely absurd to say, if you're China, wow, they're really going to go to war at the drop of a hat, or they're certainly going to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars to defeat what they call a communist or a former communist country. What are they going to do to us if we try to go into Taiwan? I think there's something plausible in that argument. I don't think it justifies what we did. I think in the end, we're weaker. We're less able, as Macron said, to influence world affairs. But I don't think it's a completely absurd argument. What about this? Finally, what even Republicans used to call the free world has clearly been strengthened. NATO has risen to the occasion, confounding the cynics, and is adding members. Western weapons have proved their effectiveness. Well, he says they proved their effectiveness. We spoke about this on Friday. Those effective Western weapons have not moved the front one whit, despite the vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive that everyone was, talking about. This is going to be the end game. Ukraine's going to win the war because we've got these new weapons and their new planes and drones and now we're sending more landmines. And what happened? Nothing. There's been no movement on the front, the Eastern Front in Ukraine. All there's been is more death, more carnage, more people who are just absolutely seeing their lives completely destroyed. And that's the bottom line, which for whatever reason Krugman seems completely oblivious to. And so many in the West, so many in our country, including those we had one time I thought were anti-war, were pro-peace, like the Squad. Not one word from them. Vote for the one guy who's out there saying this war is a disaster, Dr. Cornel West. All right, so more from our Pulitzer Prize-winning, Nobel Prize-winning economist, Paul Krugman. So here it is. Again, there you see it. The free world has clearly been strengthened. Now, this column, this article came out on the 2nd. At least that's the date line. That would be yesterday. You'd think, I would have thought, somebody as a scholar, as reputable as Paul Krugman would be familiar with the evidence that both supports and contradicts his view. So if there's an election where one of the NATO members, the people in that country, turn to somebody who opposes the war and is calling for an end to more material support, you'd think that maybe that might cause Krugman to reconsider his view that there's this united NATO that has caused our global enemies to shiver in their shoes. Let's go to NPR for the audio of this. And by the way, the last time I played this audio, that killed my audio. So I'm hoping it doesn't happen again. I doubt it. I made some tests, but let's check it out, folks.
Russia has a new friend in Europe. Slovakia, Ukraine's neighbor, just concluded parliamentary elections, and a party led by a pro-Russian politician came out on top. The leader is Robert.
Now, isn't that surprising to you? I mean, after Krugman says we are a united front, we've proven how NATO can work miracles, and I mean, it's so absurd. A NATO member just, I mean, you heard what the NPR reporter said. Russia has a new friend. How is that strengthening the alliance? And it's not just Slovakia. We talked about how Poland is no longer supplying. Poland's a member of NATO. Poland is no longer supplying Ukraine. There were very, very significant protests in Germany over the summer against continuing support for this war, for this proxy war. This is of a piece with all those columns we quoted the other day about how great things were going in the counteroffensive. And in fact, it's a quagmire. It's a stalemate. It's the trench warfare. It's an absolute nightmare. All right, let's see if we can get back to that clip. I hope I didn't go to the beginning of it again. Yeah, let me see if we can get right where we were about this remember, it's a pro-Russia leader who just got elected. See if we can get this here correct.
on top. The leader is Robert Fico. He's a two-time prime minister but was ousted in 2018 after mass protests over the murder of a journalist who was investigating government corruption. This time around, Fico campaigned on an anti-immigration, anti-LGBTQ+, and an anti-American platform. He wants to cut military support for Ukraine amid Russia's invasion and opposes EU sanctions on Russia.
So basically what our war has done is it caused the Slovakian people to embrace a corrupt former leader who is the opposite of woke, anti-LGBT. That's what he campaigned on. And they turned to him because he said, no more support for Ukraine, no more bottomless pit military aid. This is what liberals are doing, is they're putting working people who recognize just how awful these wars are, who are the ones who have to fight them over and over again. Although Krugman will let you know, hey, we're not fighting in this one. This isn't something we have to worry about our children dying in. But children are dying. Parents are dying. Wives and husbands are dying. Working people get that because they're the ones who fight these wars. And the Slovakians said, hey, we're gonna embrace this right-wing populist demagogue because he's going to get us out of this war. So if you care about the woke issues, the identity politics, then I think you got to recognize if you support this war, you're turning people against you and your policies. You're turning them against freedom and truth. So for Krugman to argue that somehow the war, the pro-peace folks, the ones who are saying we got to get out, are the, betrayers, is just so absurd. It's just the opposite. When you push and push and push for death and destruction and carnage, then you are in fact the ones who are betraying a country. And you're turning erstwhile allies like Slovakia into enemies. Krugman just completely 100% wrong. And I said, I'm not going to question his motives. I don't know what they are. He likes to question people's motives. I'm not going to do it. All right, so Krugman completely ignoring Poland, Slovakia, the protests in Germany, telling us how great this war is for a small fraction of what we spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we were in Iraq for 7 years, from 2003 to 2010. We occupied it. We fought that war on totally false pretenses and turned it into and eliminated a bulwark against ISIS. At that time, Al-Qaeda, a bulwark against Al-Qaeda. We emptied the space between Iran and Syria, so the Iranian hardliners could supply Syria, and also provided because remember, Iraq pretty much kept Iran from Syria. So everything we did in Iraq has proven to be a disaster. And it wasn't just Iraq. It was, all these other wars. Afghanistan went for 20 years, something like that. Over 20 years. And of course, those are going to have cost us a lot more. The fact that we're spending less in Ukraine, and the fact that the people who are doing the killing and dying aren't Americans, hardly strikes me as some kind of great endorsement or rationale for the war. But is it really that little? I mean, Krugman seems to think it's just a mere bag of shells. It's just a few $77 billion. He claims that we spent about $77 billion, I think is the amount he uses. What could we do? with that 77 billion. And I know we're not going to do it. I know this, neither party gives a fat rat's butt about the poor, about the struggling, about the working class. I get it. I know that it's a fool's errand to claim that somehow we could use that money, or we would use that money for something other than killing, for something other than lining the pockets of the rich and powerful. But the fact is, we've spent in 18 months almost 4 times. If you use Krugman's figure, he says 77 billion. We've got some other numbers we might use. We've spent close to 4 times what it would cost to, according to Global Giving, and which they cite HUD, $20 billion. $20 billion. So even if it was $20 billion a year, we spent 3+ times that to just aggravate a war on the other side of the globe that has only created death, destruction, carnage, and see no movement whatsoever in the front. I don't know. That's not enough. That according to Krugman, that's nothing. That ain't nothing. Who cares? Really, that's his argument. Read the piece. It's his argument. Here we go. Let's get back to it. Let's get back to Krugman. Remember that 20 billion, according to HUD, ends homelessness. I don't know about you, but I would really like to end homelessness. I like to end people's fear that they might become homeless. I'd like to end having to go into D.C. Or New York City and seeing people sleeping under bridges, sleeping under railroad bridges. I'd like to just feel like I live in a compassionate society. And it would be a legitimate, the feeling would have a basis in fact. 77 billion. It may sound like a lot. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. Sounds like a lot. His numbers, I think, are questionable. We need to spend less. We need to spend less for sure on our military. We also need to stop the spending in Ukraine. So the Republicans deserve credit. By the way, tomorrow I'm going to be discussing the debt deal. The interim continuing budget, continuing funding, which basically kept the budget exactly as it is, except for the funding for Ukraine. We'll have William Neal, friend of the show, on tomorrow. We'll get into that in great detail. I think it was a great move. He obviously opposes it. Well, I shouldn't say he obviously does. He does oppose it. We'll discuss it with him. I should not say he does. That's not right. Okay, let's get to Krugman, the response. Because Krugman is so critical of the Republicans and how they're so irresponsible, so reckless for doing this. What he says, what he calls them, enemies of democracy. And people who hate our freedoms. They like cruelty. They see Putin's regime as admirable. And he uses this support for Trump as an example of sympathy to dictator or a wannabe dictator. Enemies of democracy both abroad and at home is the argument. They want Putin to win. So is that borne out? I mean, again, where's the evidence for this? If you're gonna level those kind of charges, don't you think you really, really, really need to prove them? Those are awfully, awfully strong and incredibly divisive words by Paul Krugman. And I'm not saying it's not fair to bash Republicans. I'm not saying it's not fair to bash our elected leaders. We should do it. But to say they want Putin to win, that they admire him, it might all be true, but you got to show evidence. What's the proof? This is a letter that a number of Republicans sent on just less than a month ago. They say, unlike Krugman's number, 77 billion, they say that the U.S. has appropriated 114 billion in supplemental funding for Ukrainian countries impacted by the situation in Ukraine. A significant amount of money. This is in response to another 24 billion in security, economic, and humanitarian assistance related to the war in Ukraine, which, by the way, our Democrats all support in lockstep. So what is their response? You're out of your mind. We'll never give it to you. We want Russia to win, because that's what you'd think. You'd think it was there was a completely unmeasured, reckless, irresponsible response. But in fact, that's not what you see from these Republicans. What you see is a recognition of how much has already gone into the war. And then the point, Americans deserve to know where all that money's gone. And if it's being used effectively. Is that so, I don't know, evil? Is that malignant, as Krugman argues? Or is it true? Do we not deserve to know where the money's gone? Don't we have a right to get accurate assessments of that counteroffensive, which has gone nowhere? Are we close to victory? What's the strategy? What's the president's exit plan? We're just going to be there for another 10, 20. We've seen these endless wars. We've gained nothing from them, whether it was Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. In the end, we've been less safe as a result of all of them. So I just think, again, I'm not going to speculate what would cause Krugman, the Nobel Prize winner, to write such a demonstrably false, wrong-headed, misguided column. I'm not going to do it. I won't speculate. I have my ideas. I'm not going to talk about them because I don't know. I don't know what the hell is motivating him. I'll say one thing. I think he just so hates Trump and so hates the Republicans that anything that they say or do, he's going to be against. And remember, Trump said powerfully, I want the killing to stop. I want people not to die. Krugman cannot give him any credit for any humanity or even some kind of positive impulse. So it must be he wants Putin to win. It must be the Republicans want people to win. Now, this is not some kind of encomium or pain to the Republicans. This is, I believe, very politically calculated by them. But it's politically calculated by them to do the right thing for once. So let's recognize that in politics, no permanent allies, no permanent enemies. In this case, the Republicans are right. The Republicans who are against more funding, that small, narrow cohort that has stopped the funding, are right. Now, Krugman says that they're anti-democratic, right? He said, hey, that we, democracies defend each other, protect each other. So if you're against the war, if you're against funding it, you must be anti-democratic. But in fact, again, the policies that the Republicans are pursuing here are the Democratic policy. Most Americans don't want this war. Most Americans don't want us to keep funding it. It was, I think, very, very instructive when I talked to Arlen about this, because he was really taken aback when I showed him this poll. And it was on CNN, so you'd think, well, CNN, it's kind of liberal, right? Everyone, they hate Trump. He didn't know about this poll. It's been completely downplayed. If you read the usual suspects, you'd never know that most of us recognize just how wrong this war is. And of course, the White House, just how wrong our support of it is. And of course, the White House downplays it. Okay. All right, let's see. We got, I think I'm ready to move on to my next. Well, let's just get to a couple of comments. I wanted to show a few comments. I thought these were interesting from the article in the Times. This was kind of interesting to me, how people respond differently. Some agreeing with Krugman, and I want to get into why I think it's just crazy. So Charlie says, thank you, Dr. Krugman, for simply saying the obvious, which is, I guess, that if you're against this continued funding, you hate America and you want Putin to win and you support dictators. Thank you for simply stating the obvious. The Republican Party has morphed from unbridled plutocracy in the 80s, and I think they were basically a plutocracy for sure in the 80s, to full-on anti-popular autocracy. Okay, so it's BS to say they're anti-popular. Being against this ongoing funding is actually popular. So they aren't being anti-popular, they're being popular. And they're also certainly not being autocratic, because most people don't want us to keep funding the war. But this is what really caught my attention. Every working class Republican should consider that once ethnic and ideological cleansing starts, it doesn't stop. Here's my response to that. Every elite Democrat should realize that working class voters have very little luxury to consider months, years down the line in our society. That it's more expensive than ever to live in the United States, and they're going to vote for what they believe will make their lives just a little easier over the next month, the next 3 months, the next year. That's how they're going to vote. And so if you want those working class votes and you want to win elections, then you better sure as hell support economic justice at every opportunity. Equal wages, much higher wages for working people, real wages, and an end to the billionaire class. If you don't support that, yes, you're driving working class voters right into the arms of Republicans, as we've seen. And by the way, not just white voters either. Not just white voters either. All right, here is another comment I really liked. And I wanted to share this from the Times article, a response to Krugman. And I think it's especially interesting because Dave BX here writes, I do not agree with this headline, betray Ukraine. Remember what I said? It's just a BS headline. We didn't betray Ukraine. We don't owe the Ukrainian citizens some kind of endless, or Zelensky some kind of endless, bottomless supply of weaponry. But I think it's really interesting that Dave BX, who then writes, I absolutely support Ukraine and Russia is def the aggressor. But when did we as a country swear an oath to Ukraine? Exactly. We didn't betray Ukraine. And then when did we as American citizens have a national debate and decide as a nation to wage a proxy war? And then he continues, and this unlimited support in the hundreds of billions of dollars is mostly going to behemoth defense contractors, which hold huge political sway in both parties. And it's at the expense of our own citizens. No question. Yes, exactly. Thank you, Dave BX. All right, you're watching Ginsburg. It's Halitics. Click like, click subscribe the bottom right corner of your screen. I need your help. I need your support. I want to get to 1,000. I know that sounds like a lot. We'll get there. 240-363-7190. Just a couple of other quick points about why this war has been such a complete screw up. I mean, look, the biggest, I believe, and Shade, has some comments about this. Maybe we'll get to those. I hope to. I hope to today, but I'm taking a lot of time on Ukraine. But, I think many of us, especially on the left, or perhaps only on the left, recognize the climate cataclysm is the biggest challenge we face. And we're losing that battle for the hearts and minds of voters and citizens here in U.S. and Europe. The push to move away from the internal combustion engine is becoming an election issue on two counts. Why is that? Because people are terrified of losing what little they have. because they don't have the luxury of thinking long term about what the environmental crisis is doing. They care about the environment, they care about their environment, but right now they care more about paying their rent and having food on the table tonight. And who can blame them? Who cannot understand that? That's just human nature. We always discount the future for the present. Unless we live in a relatively secure present, we don't have we can't worry about the future. And people don't feel secure. They don't feel that they're in a position where they can just simply focus on 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, what the world will look like when their children are grown up or their grandchildren are having children. They don't have that luxury. Most don't. And this is the fault of the neolibs. This is the fault of the corporatists. By taking away power, by taking away influence, by taking away money from working people, we have made them more desperate, less able to think about the future, more willing to follow autocrats and authoritarians, especially if they promise them something which is good, like an end to endless war. I thought this was so interesting from Politico. I really appreciate them putting this out there in their energy newsletter, which is, to be frank with you, much better than it has any reason for being, given that it's actually sponsored by Chevron. But and we got a caller, so I'll get to you in just a sec, caller, I promise. But if you can see this, there's the populist resistance to climate policies as voters feel the pinch of rising prices. Well, if we had a much more equitable and equal distribution of wealth, both in Europe and the United States, then people would be more able to weather those rising prices. And they would also, I lost my caller, I'm so sorry. Call back, 240-363-7190. And I think if you don't feel that you're being exploited by big corporations and retailers, then you're less likely to fall prey to climate hustlers who claim that the climate cataclysm is a hoax. So, more about this. Globalism is a huge reason for the skepticism about moving towards clean, green electric vehicles. Czech lawmaker Alexander Vondra labeled supporters of tightened vehicle pollution limits the grave diggers of the automotive industry in Europe. Why? Because they're all saying this will benefit China. Because they're reasonably fear-mongering that any kind of regulations or any kind of requirements that new vehicles be cleaner and greener will lead to more production, more offshoring in China. How do you address that? You don't offshore to China. You have very high tariffs that protect your industries, your workers, that incentivize entrepreneurs to build in your country. And you make the point that when we phase out petrol and diesel vehicles, we'll actually be saving money because our country is an importer. Now, there's European countries that are net producers like UK and Norway, but they will ultimately still be better off. They'll be cleaner, greener, if you make the case that, and you have to make it legitimately, that you're going to have clean, green jobs. They're not going to Asia. They're not going to Latin America. You do that with tariffs. You build yourself credibility. You get the confidence of the people by fighting for them at every step of the way. So I want to I think here's Shade, and this is my response to Shade's point, which I think is very fair. And I had mentioned this last week, or maybe it was yesterday. Your laser focus, Hal, on the environment reflects your values as a progressive, white, upper middle class male with no real financial concerns. Okay. I don't know how being white or male has anything to do with this. I really don't. Maybe there's something there. I don't know. I don't. Yes, I'm progressive in part because I care about the environment. So I think it goes the other way. I don't focus on the environment because I'm progressive. I'm progressive because I care about the environment. But okay. So I totally 100% agree with you that my privileged economic status allows me the luxury of focusing on the environment. You're right. But I recognize that fact. That's why I talk not the only reason I care about poor, struggling, working people. I want them to have a decent life. I don't want my country corrupted by a few plutocrats. So I do talk very, very much, I don't think you mentioned this part, but you do mention taxing the bads, which is the billionaire class, tariffs, etc. I recognize that inequality is an enormous driver of the climate crisis. That's why I talk about one of the reasons I talk so much about economic justice. We're not going to address the climate cataclysm. We're not going to stop the new Holocaust unless we address inequality. So when you say your primary concern seems to be what? Well, I think this is maybe true. Your primary concern seems to be what can be done to improve the world environment that will be left to your children. Yes, that is certainly a primary concern. How about the primary? But it's certainly important to me. Medicare for all, ending poverty, those are all important to me. But the selfish concern, if you want to call it that, my selfish concern for my family and their future is actually consistent with a pro-economic justice stance as well. Because only when others are economically secure do I believe we can get to the, will we address the environmental crisis. He says, I don't believe your plan will work as you hope because it will not be economically or physically feasible to immediately subsidize a replacement vehicle for everyone who needs one. Well, I don't know that we can. I agree. I don't think it's probably economically or physically feasible to immediately subsidize a replacement vehicle for everyone who needs one either. I guess it sort of depends on what your needs are. How you define need. But I certainly believe, let me say this, that until we guarantee everybody enough, a place to live, food, a job that has some, future in it and that challenges you mentally, until we guarantee everyone that leisure culture, we're not going to address the climate crisis. Now, does that mean you get a replacement vehicle? Yeah, maybe you get a solar-powered bus or some type of walkway. You have to work closer to your job. I don't know. I would say, again, that when you make the cost of fossil fuels relatively much, much, much more expensive than other fuels, other energy sources, and at the same time, you take the money that you get from taxing those fossil fuels, which more of it will come from the rich, since they consume more, and you redistribute it, people will actually be better off, at least in the short term, and will have that money to transition. To the extent that there are those who are made worse off, we'll have to address their concerns immediately as well. That's our job. That's our duty. That's our responsibility as human beings. All right, that's going to do it. That's it for me. Remember, tomorrow, I'm so glad I got to do this live stream. Tomorrow, we'll be talking to William Neal. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of that interim ongoing funding of government until for another 2 months or so, until the next debt crisis, until we're up against the next debt crisis. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Please, again, I beg you, click like and even more importantly, click subscribe.